One of my favorite New Yorker cartoons features a father looking at his teenage son and yelling, "Young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures." This cartoon may be especially appealing to a psychology professor and mom of three passing through that age. But it illustrates something very real about how the brain changes over time. Adults, at least those older than about 25, think with the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that carefully evaluates situations before making a decision and takes into consideration the long-term consequences. Teenagers often do something quite different, instead, relying largely on the amygdala, the emotional part of the brain. This is why teenagers often make rash decisions, in which you literally say to them, "What were you thinking?" But that's often not the right question, because they actually weren't thinking, they were feeling. In my very first introduction to psychology as an undergraduate at Stanford in 1987, I learned about lots of studies that examine people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. But at that time, we had no real idea what was happening in the brain. Then, starting in the early 1990s, breakthroughs in technology have allowed us to see how people's brains respond in different situations and to different stimuli. Findings in neuroscience have revealed that physical exercise stimulates the brain in ways that improve cognitive skills, that people who procrastinate differ in particular parts of the brain compared to those who don't, and that psychotherapy can literally change someone's brain. Let's start with an overview of how we study the brain and what's been learned. Some of our earliest knowledge about how different parts of the brain have different functions came from studying how people with different brain injuries experience distinct types of impairments. In 1848, a young railroad foreman named Phineas Gage suffered a tragic accident while packing explosive powder into a hole, when the powder detonated, sending a metal rod directly into his face. The rod entered his left cheek, tore through his brain, exited the back of his skull, and then landed 80 feet away. Gage survived the severe injury and was able to walk to a nearby cart so that he could be taken to receive medical treatment. He remained conscious the entire time and was even able to speak. After Gage's recovery, he tried to return to work, but was soon fired. Reports at the time described him as a changed man after the accident, shifting from a previously friendly, efficient, and capable worker to one who was impulsive and unreliable. As one of his friends described, Gage was no longer Gage. Although it's clear that Gage's personality changed considerably following the accident, more recent examinations of his life suggest he was less severely injured than is often described. He spent many years driving stagecoaches, which required relatively high-level motor, cognitive, and interpersonal skills. But this case remains an important one in the field of psychology because it was the first to suggest specific areas of the brain control certain functions. This is what we now call the localization of brain function. And modern techniques provide even more insight into how different parts of the brain function. One such approach, the electroencephalography, or EEG, involves placing electrodes on a person's head and then measuring the electrical activity produced by the brain's neurons during different tasks. An EEG can measure changes in brainwave patterns during different stages of sleep or while a person is reading, writing, or speaking. Studies using EEG reveal that brain activity differs when people view members of different groups, men versus women, Black people versus white people. This type of categorization happens automatically with little or no conscious awareness or control. It can also be used to measure patterns of brain activity while someone is moving around, which can be especially useful when studying children. In 2018, researchers at the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences at the University of Washington placed caps containing EEG electrodes on 2-month-old babies to see how their brains responded when different parts of their body were gently tapped. When the baby's left hand or foot was touched, the researchers saw activity in the right side of the brain. This study shows that stimulation from the environment, when parents touch their baby's hands or feet, actually helps develop that particular part of the brain. These same parts of the brain were also active when babies kicked their feet against a mobile or opened or closed their hands. However, the brain's structure and localized activity are revealed much better with magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, which takes a picture of the brain's anatomy. MRI later led to fMRI, or functional MRI, which investigates which part of the brain is handling specific functions. An fMRI measures small changes in blood flow that occur while the brain is performing a particular type of task, such as reading or moving. These techniques can be used to determine what part of the brain responds to some task or stimulus, such as seeing a picture of a spider or while listening to music. They can also be used to evaluate whether multiple parts of the brain are firing or lighting up in response to the same stimulus. One fascinating study using fMRI data examined patterns of brain activity in young kids as they looked at math equations where the answer shown might be correct or not, such as 7 plus 2 equals 9 or 8 minus 2 equals 5. Children who were high in math anxiety showed less activity in a particular part of the brain that's responsible for mathematical reasoning, showing the part of the brain that should have been evaluating the answer wasn't really engaging. Meanwhile, another part of the brain, the amygdala, which processes negative emotions, was very active. Imagine being able to identify kids at risk of math phobia early on, which could help us take steps to reduce such anxiety. The brain is divided into 3 major sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain is the part of the brain directly above the spinal cord and directs basic processes that you need to survive: respiration, heart rate, and arousal. The hindbrain consists of 3 separate parts: the medulla, which is essentially an extension of the spinal cord and conveys messages to and from the brain; the pons, which carries information between several areas of the brain, such as between upper and lower parts of the brain; and the cerebellum, which controls fine muscle movement and balance. When you play the piano or hit a tennis ball, you are activating the cerebellum. The second major part of the brain is the midbrain, which is located above the hindbrain. Running through the hindbrain and midbrain is a network of neurons called the reticular formation that maintains consciousness, regulates behavioral arousal, and alerts other parts of the brain to important events. Because of its control over basic processes necessary for survival, damage to this part of the brain is instantly fatal. The midbrain helps orient our eyes and bodies to both visual and auditory information in the world. It's also involved in regulating movement. The midbrain contains a small structure known as the substantia nigra that secretes dopamine, a neurotransmitter. Parkinson's disease, a progressive disorder causing problems with movement and balance, develops when cells in this part of the brain begin to die, leading to a loss of dopamine, which in turn causes problems with movement. This is why drugs that provide dopamine can substantially reduce, though not eliminate, the symptoms of Parkinson's. The third and largest major part of the brain is the forebrain, which controls your thoughts, motivations, and emotions. The forebrain is involved in complex emotional, cognitive, and behavioral processes: body weight, emotions, sex drive, and so on. It includes 4 key structures, each of which plays a distinctive role in making us who we are and in what makes us unique and different from other people. The limbic system is an interconnected group of structures, including the amygdala and hippocampus, that is generally responsible for emotions and memory. The amygdala, a structure within the limbic system, processes emotions, and in particular, fear. A fascinating study comparing brain scans of people in prison for committing murder to people of their same age and background, but not in prison, found that this part of the brain was about 18% smaller for those convicted of murder. This finding suggests that people who commit murder may not experience the same feelings of remorse and guilt that other people do, which of course may make it easier to commit this sort of crime. They also may not have the same fear of consequences, such as spending the rest of their life in prison. On a more positive note, a study of brain activity in people who had engaged in a quite extraordinary act of generosity, donating a kidney to a total stranger, revealed nearly the opposite finding. The donor's amygdala was found to be 8% larger than it is in most people. The hippocampus, another part of the limbic system, is involved in forming, organizing, and storing memories. It's also involved in connecting sensations and emotions to these memories, which is why a particular smell or song can often trigger a specific memory. The second major structure of the forebrain, the thalamus, is basically the brain's switchboard or air traffic control system. It takes in information from various sensory systems throughout the body and then directs that information to the appropriate part of the brain. Directly underneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which controls temperature as well as many basic motives and drives: hunger, thirst, sex, aggression. Many people find it hard to maintain weight loss over the long term, and one explanation is that eating a diet high in fat and sugar for years can damage the hypothalamus. It's like the gas gauge in your car is always pointing to empty, even when you've just filled it up. So people continue to feel hungry and eat, even when their body absolutely doesn't need those extra calories, making it really hard to lose weight. The thin surface layer of the brain is called the cerebral cortex, and it controls the most complex behaviors and higher mental processes. Recognizing a friend, reading a book, playing games. The cerebral cortex is very thin, about 1/8 of an inch thick, but its numerous wrinkles create a much larger surface area. Just below the cerebral cortex, the brain is divided lengthwise into two cerebral hemispheres, which together amount to about 80% of the brain's total weight. These hemispheres are made up of about 30 billion neurons and 9 times as many glial cells, which provide support and protection for the neurons. The two hemispheres of the forebrain control opposite sides of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of the body, and vice versa. These two hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, a large bundle of more than 200 million nerve fibers located just above the thalamus, which sends information back and forth between the two sides. For example, let's say you are writing a letter using your right hand. Sensory information, such as the feel of the pen in your hand, would be passed from your right hand up the somatosensory cortex on the left side of the brain. But that information must also be shared with the right side of your brain, so it travels across the corpus callosum to the other hemisphere. However, contrary to some popular accounts, the two hemispheres do work together in a coordinated and integrated way. You don't just use one side of your brain at a time. Instead, the two sides tend to work together on related aspects of a task. For example, the left hemisphere might process the specific words you are hearing in a conversation, while the right hemisphere would help you understand the tone and context of the words. Each hemisphere of the forebrain is divided into 4 distinct areas, or lobes, which each specialize in somewhat different tasks. The frontal lobes, by far the largest of the 4 lobes, are located at the top front of the brain, right behind the forehead. The frontal lobes are in charge of motor control, speech production, and various higher level functions, such as personality, memory, emotion, and thinking. They are also responsible for executive functioning tasks, such as planning, working memory, and impulse control, which are among the last areas of the brain to fully develop. Notice that some more complex functions, such as memory and emotion, are processed in multiple parts of the brain, the limbic system, but also the frontal lobes. Many of the areas of the brain interact with one another to create our thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Damage to a particular part of the frontal lobes, known as Broca's area, results in difficulty speaking. This type of impaired language ability is known as Broca's aphasia. Other damage to the frontal lobes is often seen in people with schizophrenia, a serious mental disorder in which people have trouble interpreting reality. In the top rear of the brain are the parietal lobes, which receive and interpret sensations from all over the body, including pressure, pain, touch, temperature, and location. This part of the brain includes the somatosensory cortex, which processes information about touch. Regions of the body with more area of the somatosensory cortex devoted to them, such as the face and fingers, are more sensitive to touch. Located near your temples of your skull are the temporal lobes, which have a major role in processing feelings. They are close to the ears and receive and make sense of sounds, noises from the environment, as well as speech. The auditory cortex, which is located on the top of each temporal lobe, is responsible for receiving incoming sounds and then passing it on to the parietal lobes, where sound input is combined with other types of sensory information. Damage to a particular part of the temporal lobe, known as Wernicke's area, results in impaired language comprehension. People with this impairment, which is known as Wernicke's aphasia, cannot understand what they read or hear, yet they can speak. So their speech is unintelligible. They use made-up words and sounds. At the rear base of the skull are the occipital lobes, and they are responsible for processing visual stimulation received from the eyes. Damage to the occipital lobes can cause blindness, even if the eyes and their neural pathways to the brain are perfectly fine. Although scientists initially thought that only concussions or more serious levels of traumatic brain injury could lead to impairments, more recent research suggests even more minor head impact can result in changes in the brain. In one 2012 study, college football and ice hockey players wore special helmets for an entire season that recorded how fast the head moved after any contact with another player to calculate the intensity of each blow to the head. Tests at the end of the season revealed that even when hits didn't lead to a concussion, players showed atrophy in the corpus callosum, which may well contribute to long-term impairments, including aggression, depression, and memory loss. So far, I've described the different functions of each part of the brain as if they are fixed. But more recent research, beginning in the mid-1990s, has found that the functions and structure of the brain can and do change, sometimes even during adulthood. The brain's ability to adapt to our changing needs based on experience is known as neuroplasticity. Thus, when certain parts of the brain are injured, we now know that in some cases, other parts of the brain take over their functions. The brain therefore seems to reorganize to compensate for damage to particular areas of the brain and allow for at least some restored abilities. This process is stronger and easier in young children, who in some cases show considerable changes in the brain, including recovery from serious injury. But even adult brains show some evidence of changing, including restoring old connections and functions that have not been used for some time and forming new pathways. For example, older adults with early signs of cognitive impairment who are assigned to take country dancing lessons, which involves pretty complex choreography, show improvements in brain structure 6 months later. Those who engage in other forms of exercise, brisk walking or gentle stretching, show no such changes, indicating that learning some new skill helps stimulate brain growth in distinct ways. In another study, researchers assigned older adults, ages 60 to 90, to engage in some type of activity for 15 hours a week for 3 months. Some of them were asked to learn a complex new skill, such as digital photography or quilting. something that required active engagement as well as high-level memory and cognitive processes. Others were asked to engage in individual activities that were more familiar and passive, listening to music or completing word puzzles. Still others were asked to participate in purely social activities without a new challenge, going on field trips or watching some type of entertainment. And adults who learned a complex new skill showed more improved cognitive functioning than those in the other two groups. These findings explain why people who regularly engage in mentally stimulating activities, taking classes, visiting museums, listening to great courses, and so on, are less likely to develop memory problems, including dementia and Alzheimer's disease. There's a great Japanese proverb that vividly illustrates this point. We begin aging when we stop learning. However, there are limits to the brain's ability to reorganize. Infants who are born with cataracts, a clouding over the eye's natural lens, are never able to experience normal vision, even after undergoing surgery to remove the cataracts, unless the surgery is performed very early in life, within 6 to 10 weeks after birth. Why? The brain cells that normally process visual information either stop working or are converted to process other types of sensory information. So at least in some cases, the development of brain cells is a use it or lose it proposition. The brain can also change in response to environmental factors and experiences. For example, when blind people learn to read Braille using their fingers, the part of the brain dedicated to processing touch, the parietal lobe, expands. Similarly, string musicians who first start playing their instrument in childhood, when brain reorganization can happen more easily, have larger and more complex neural pathways linked to the fingers on their left hand, which controls the notes they play, than those whose music training started later in life. In a particularly clever study, researchers at Stanford University found that playing Pokemon, a video game featuring hundreds of specific cartoon characters, can lead to long-term changes in how the brain reorganizes a place for this particular visual information. They compared brain activity in adults who were experienced Pokemon players, meaning they played regularly during childhood and then returned to playing again as adults, and in adults who had never played the game. Adults who played this game repeatedly during childhood had greater activation in a part of the temporal lobe in response to images of the specific Pokemon cartoon characters than did people who had not played this video game as a child. The experienced players also showed greater activation to these characters than to other types of images of animals, faces, cars, and even other cartoons. People without any Pokemon experience showed no differences in their response to different types of images. So, even Pokemon experiences in the world can change how our brains respond, basically showing that experience matters. This ability of the brain to reorganize in response to daily life experience helps explain a perhaps puzzling finding. In London taxi drivers, the part of the brain responsible for spatial representation, the mid-posterior hippocampus, is larger than in London bus drivers. These differences held true even when researchers took into account other factors that could explain such differences, such as driving experience and level of stress. This difference seems to be brains changing in response to the fact that London taxi drivers must acquire and use knowledge of a large and complex city, not just repeatedly drive a set route. This finding that the brain forms new connections and makes new pathways in response to life experiences has tremendous practical implications. Researchers at MIT found that young children who have more back and forth conversations with adults show much more activation in Broca's area, the part of the brain that is involved in speech production and language processing, when they listen to stories. This greater brain activation fully predicts children's scores on tests of language skills, including vocabulary, grammar, and verbal reasoning. So these findings tell us that back and forth conversation with adults actually changes children's brains in ways that improve their ability to use language. Teaching parents to engage their young kids in conversation, not just hearing words, but really practicing trying to understand what someone is trying to say and then responding, could therefore have lasting benefits. It's certainly an important finding that new life experiences create new pathways in the brain. But there's another equally important finding, that the brain also gets rid of old, useless pathways. Getting rid of irrelevant pathways is as important a part of brain development as forming new ones. Let me explain why. From the moment of birth, a baby's brain is constantly changing and developing as it's flooded with new sensory information. Each new experience a child has, learning a new word, seeing the ocean for the first time, meeting a new person, has to be sent to the brain so that it can be processed, which leads to changes in brain structure, function, or both. As each brain cell matures, it forms more and more neural connections with other brain cells, which is why babies add more than 1 million new neural connections every second. This process leads to rapid brain growth during the first few years of life. At birth, each neuron in the cerebral cortex has about 2,500 connections. But 2 or 3 years later, each neuron has about 15,000 connections. And that's about twice as many neural connections as the average adult brain. This is far, far more connections than the brain needs and makes processing information slow and inefficient. Between early childhood and adulthood, a natural process known as synaptic pruning takes place, in which the brain basically decides which connections are important to keep and which ones can be let go. Connections that are regularly activated are maintained because the brain gets that they are obviously important. But weaker connections, those that are rarely called upon, are slowly pruned away. So the brain is basically getting more settled in its structure during adolescence as children transition into adulthood. This natural maturation process allows for more complex thought processes and more sustained attention. But it also shuts certain doors. The brain becomes less flexible as neural connections are pruned away. So, if a child experiences a brain injury at age 10, another part of the brain can take over the functions of the part that is damaged. If this same injury occurs at age 20, that shift is no longer possible. This pruning process also explains why it's almost impossible to learn to speak a new language without an accent as an adult, or even as a teenager. If children use their brain for only one language during their first few years of life, the neural connections that would allow them to easily learn a second or third language are pruned away, which is why teenagers and adults learn languages much more slowly and less efficiently than small kids. All of the different parts of the brain and their distinct and sometimes overlapping functions come together with life experiences. Playing an instrument, playing Pokemon, learning a new language to influence brain development. And for me, one of the most intriguing questions in the field of neuroscience is how much our brains influence our behavior versus how much our behavior is influencing our brains. Here's an example. People who donate a kidney to a stranger have a larger and more active amygdala, which may lead them to care more about other people and therefore to engage in this truly selfless behavior. But it's also possible that engaging in this type of extreme altruism could actively rewire the brain, leading the amygdala to increase in size and become more active. Here's another example. People who are especially attuned to social conflict and care more about fitting in with the crowd also have a larger orbital frontal cortex. For these people, feeling different feels really bad. For other people, this region of the prefrontal cortex is smaller and fitting in may not matter as much, which makes it easier for them to stand up to social pressure. So, are some people born with a larger orbital frontal cortex? Or does resisting social pressure over time cause this region to increase in size? Or perhaps it's both. What research tells us so far is that individual differences in such things as the ability to stand up to social influence can be mapped out in the brain. Next time, we'll explore how the rest of the nervous system influences our thoughts, feelings, and behavior, including decision making, depression, and bonding.